Hello, everybody, and welcome to this brief introduction to some Australian and Oceanian geography. And this is just kind of going to be a short introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit less about the demographics. That's going to be tomorrow. We're going to talk about the people tomorrow. Today, we're going to talk more about the physical geography, the climate, what the kind of climate and environment is like in this region. So one thing to know is that because it lies in the southern hemisphere, and Australia is the only continent that lies entirely in the southern hemisphere, the pattern of seasons is reversed. So what does that mean? Well, it means that right now, this time of year that we think of as spring, March through June, is actually their fall. They're going into winter. So winter in Australia is June through September. And then their spring is September through December, and then their summer is the end of December through March. And so January and February are actually the hottest times of the year in Australia. Australians, on Christmas Day, December 25th, they don't have snow. It's 90 degrees. They're going to the beach on Christmas Day. So think about that. I think it changes, how you think about the year, and indeed their school year is flipped, right? So their school year, generally speaking, starts at the end of February, the beginning of March, kind of in their fall, and then they go through, June, July through their winter up until I think about the end of November, which is the end of their school year in the summertime there, almost the summer, and then they have the summer, December and January, totally off of school like we do. So they have a summer vacation. It's just on the other side of the year. And the reason that is, it has to do with the tilt of the Earth, right? So it's not that the Earth is closer or farther away from the sun. That's a common misconception, but if it were true, right, it wouldn't have this reverse effect. It's actually the tilt of the Earth, that when the northern hemisphere is tilted so it receives direct rays from the sun, and that's our summer, the southern hemisphere is tilted away. It receives less direct rays, and therefore it's cooler, and therefore it is their winter. And then, of course, the things reverse themselves when the planet moves around the sun farther. A couple of vocabulary terms that are going to be important, not so much for Australia, but for Oceania, are these. First, atolls. Atolls are usually very small islands, and they form actually on top of reefs. And so on atolls, there's not really necessarily a whole lot of land. It's more kind of land that's accumulated on the top of these reefs. And I can show you some pictures of atolls later. They usually, what you see with an atoll is that there's a part of shallow ocean surrounding the actual land part of the land, because there's part of the land which is above water, right, where the land is built up on, obviously. But then as you kind of go away from that, there's still part of the reef that is below water, but not far below water. The thing with atolls to keep in mind is because it's basically just the land that's on top of the reef, these things are not usually very high up, right? So their highest point might be, 3 or 4 feet above sea level. And so these places are very fragile to things like hurricanes or things that are going to cause, waves to wash up, because those waves can wash pretty far inland. And I'm going to tell you later about some reasons why we might be concerned right now about people who live on atolls. And many of the little tiny islands that you see out in Oceania are atolls. It's atolls where people live. They tend to also live in archipelagos. An archipelago is a chain of many islands, and we see a whole bunch of examples of archipelagos in Oceania. So when you talk about Polynesia, that's kind of a big archipelago, but we could talk about even smaller ones, like the Marshall Islands, or the Solomon Islands. Those are all examples. There's a chain of islands Hawaii is an archipelago, right? Hawaii is made up of many, some larger than others, but many basically small islands, and they are all kind of in the same general area, and they make up an archipelago. All right, let's talk about Australia. Australian climate. Australia, obviously, it's a continent. It's a continent that happens to be made up of only one country. But it's a continent, and so it has a variety of climates throughout it. But as a general rule, Australia is generally warm and dry. It is warmer and wetter in the north, and remember, because it's in the southern hemisphere, unlike here, like in the northern hemisphere, it gets warmer as you move south, colder as you move north. In Australia, that's reversed. It actually gets warmer the farther north you go, and cooler the farther south you go. And so if you go up to like the northern coast of Australia, that area is quite warm, but it also tends to be a little bit wetter up there. It tends to almost be tropical feeling. The north is actually home to some rainforests. The southeast, which is the most densely populated area, is temperate, and so it's cooler, and it has moderate rainfall. And so then that's the area you see agriculture, and ergo, that's where you see the populations. The interior of Australia, the outback desert, is extremely dry. It's not like a sandy desert, like when we talk about the Sahara, right? There's these massive sand dunes, and it looks like you can just sink right into them. The outback isn't like that. The outback is what we call a scabby desert. There's hard, packed earth. There's rock. There might be some kind of desert plant life. And there are, in fact, animals that live out in the outback that are adapted to survive in those conditions. But humans not really amongst those. The outback is a pretty lightly populated zone. There's not a lot of opportunity for agriculture. There's not a lot of human settlement. There is some mining that goes on, but other than that, that's pretty much it. It's, a big empty space as far as humans are concerned. When we talk about New Zealand, New Zealand's North Island is warm and humid, kind of semi-tropical. It has rolling hills. The South Island is more temperate. They actually kind of regularly get snow in the South Island, but again, remember that snow is going to come in like June and July, and the South Island is pretty mountainous. It's like one of the few areas, like Australia, doesn't really have a whole lot of mountains that are considerably high, whereas the South Island of New Zealand has some pretty serious mountains. It's like some of the only areas where in this region where you can find snow-capped mountains. I'll tell you more about Australian climate when we kind of go to our map segment. I think this might be, is this the last one? Yes. Okay, so the last slide I want to share with you is a kind of really important current issue that deals with this region, and that's climate change. As the climate's changing, it's really threatening a lot of the livelihoods that go on in these regions. So first of all, let's talk about the atolls, right? So since they're built upon underwater reefs, they're barely above sea level, maybe just a few feet. Well, as global warming melts polar ice and raises sea levels, some of these islands, including like entire countries that are made up of, that are archipelagos of atolls, and so there are a whole bunch of small, low-lying islands, these nations are threatened by flooding. They might actually just disappear under the water. There's actually, I know there's one place. After World War II, the United States, which owns some of these islands, or at least did at the time, did some nuclear testing. So that they blew up nuclear warheads on these islands. They moved everybody off, and then they said, I wonder what happens if you blow up a nuclear bomb on this island here. That created some radioactive waste, and so they dug a big hole on one of these islands and put it all in there and covered it in concrete and said, all right, that's good to go. We'll just leave it like that. Well, unfortunately, that island is flooding as the ocean levels are rising, and the water is kind of slowly creeping up to where this hole is. And the fear is that if this, big pit floods, radioactive contamination is going to spread all throughout this island, and it's going to be devastating for fisheries and, other important environmental aspects that these people rely on for their livelihoods. Not to mention, how would you like radioactive waste washing up in your backyard? One thing where this was really made evident in terms of climate change was actually last year. And I know this probably seems like, ages ago, but if you remember last fall, there were these devastating wildfires in Australia. And one of the things climate change is having is that it's making extreme weather more common. And so when you have environmentally sensitive ecosystems like you do in Australia, which is really kind of a unique environment, climate change could really disrupt those. And so what you saw with these wildfires is these extreme weather events, which are now causing real damage to these sensitive ecosystems and indeed to, the livelihood of Australians. And one of the kind of ironic things was that after the wildfires ended, all of a sudden you had massive rain. And so, while the wildfires are going, people were like, it needs to rain, we're going through a drought. And then that flipped on its head to all of a sudden there was flooding, which seems silly, but, that's how it worked. It was from one extreme to the other. Before we take off, I just wanted to show you a few maps here and do some exploration to kind of illustrate this point. So, item 1 is a climate map of Australia, and you can see that here in the north, the red, that indicates hot and humid. And then the orange and yellow, excuse me, I promise I don't have COVID, just a little tickle in my throat. The orange and the yellow represent areas that are hot and dry. And so if you remember doing the map of Australia, that correlates pretty well, excuse me, to where the outback is. The green and blue indicate temperate zones. Look at where the major cities are. Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, all the major cities of Australia are all in that temperate region. And indeed, if we look at population density, you see that it matches up very well with that temperate region. Here in the southeast, the east coast, and then a little pocket on the southwest there. So you see more people living in the temperate region, which again, that makes sense with the things that we've seen earlier in this year. One of the kind of ironic things about Australia is that if you look at Australia's population density as a whole, it's very low. Australia has a very low population density. Australia is about the size of the United States. It's a little smaller, but it has about 1/11 as many people. And so, imagine, the United States, but imagine 90% of the people not living there. And so all of a sudden you'd think, oh wow, Australians must have all this open space. But it's actually not like that, because so much of Australia is basically uninhabited. The people who do live in Australia live in these very large, packed-in cities. So you have the irony of a country with very low population density, but a population that is very heavily urbanized. And, that seems like an oxymoron at first, but, there it is. Just a couple of things to show you. If you look at the Google Maps view of Australia, you can really see the outback desert as kind of this big, rusty red spot. It almost looks like the surface of Mars has been superimposed here on the western 2/3 of the continent. And you can very easily see that kind of temperate and tropical zone here, that more humid area where you see that plant life showing through. A few kind of iconic things about Australia. Mostly, I'm going to focus on the 3 cities here. First, Melbourne. If you're a tennis fan at all, you know that the Australian Open takes place in Melbourne. Melbourne is, really kind of considered to be a cool city in Australia. They have a great zoo, great culture here. And let's see. Oh yeah, so Australians like British sports like cricket. Australians are generally speaking kind of very sporty people, I think. And so they take their sports their cricket, their rugby very seriously. Sydney, almost certainly the most famous city on Australia. And of course, there's that famous Sydney Harbour there with the bridge and the Opera House. And let's see if I can kind of zoom in and get you a street view. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, look at that. Look at that. So you can see that this is a, major city. And Australia is quite a wealthy country. You can kind of think there's these 5 wealthy English-speaking countries: the United States and Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. And so, Australia, I think just by looking at this, you can see that this is a country that's pretty wealthy. I mean, here's a cruise ship coming in, big skyscrapers. These guys look pretty well off. This Sydney Opera House, one of the most famous structures in the whole world. And then the other thing about Australia is interesting is that, kind of like the United States, they built their own capital city. They just kind of were like, well, we don't want the capital to be any old city. We're going to just pick a city, build a new city basically out of nothing for the capital. And so the capital is here. But kind of unlike Washington, Canberra, with the capital of Canada, is still kind of almost rural in some ways. Like, it's not that built up. So let's see if we can drop down here. And this is like their Washington, D.C. And I've, happened to drop down an area where you can't even see any buildings at all. I think if we go up this way, this is the old Capitol building of Canada. But yeah, you can see that this area is really, it's pretty open. And so you do have a few areas still in Australia where, you have these wide open spaces. Canberra being one, kind of this backcountry region here being one. But for the most part, most Australians live in big cities like Melbourne or Sydney. And the rural population is relatively small. We'll go ahead and just finish it out, go down to New Zealand, where you can see, the tropical North Island here, and then you can see the mountainous South Island here. And I've always wanted to go to New Zealand. New Zealand seems like it has a really interesting climate, and someday I hope to go there. All right, well, that was just a fun little introduction of Australian and Oceania. Oh, I want to show you an atoll. Okay. Perfect example. All right, so here's some examples of atolls. And so you can see for the most part, they're barely, some of them aren't even over the water. Like this one here looks like it's totally submerged. But this one here in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see just a little bit of it out of the water, just kind of poking out over the rest of this reef. And so you can imagine that if the sea level got just a little bit higher, that these guys would be in trouble. I think it does look like there's a building there, there's a boat here, maybe there's a harbor here, I don't know. But, rising sea levels would really put this thing in danger. And there's lots of people in Oceania who live on islands just like this, who are, seeing the seas rise and kind of thinking, that better stop. All right, like I said, this is just meant to be a short introduction. Hopefully you guys could take those notes down. I sent you a link with a page. You need to create a copy of that page and type the notes. Obviously, you can go back in the video and pause when those notes were up and type those notes in there. And then we will do the rest of them. Did 4 today. There's only 4 more to do. We'll do 4 more tomorrow, and that will wrap up the note-taking portion of this unit. All right, thanks, guys, and take care, and I will see you guys tomorrow.